Hello and welcome back. In this video, we'll be looking at how I went about making this floating head buoy. We'll be looking at the different layers of effects that I added to just get the whole effect to really meld together. And what I was really going for is to try and get that head as it's emerging to really feel like there's some form of energy underneath its skin that's kind of driving this morphing as it's coming into existence. So we'll begin by building out this effect from the outside in. And we'll start with that slicing effect on the mesh. So inside Blender, I'll just select our object and make sure the cursor is on the object so that I can add a cube and make sure it covers that head nicely. So with that cube added, I'll make sure to go here and under display as, set it to wire so that we can see what we are working with. With the cube selected, I'll go into edit mode and shape it so that it's nicely covering our subject. Then I'll make sure it covers it in all the dimensions, just like that. And because of a few things I know I'll be doing using this cube and the modifiers I'll be adding to it, I know I will want a bit more geometry on it, so I'll just subdivide it a few times. Subdivide, something like that is nice. So just like that. So this cube will be the Boolean object that we'll be using to hide and reveal the mesh underneath. So if you wanted it to animate the mesh appearing from the bottom, you'd do something like this. But because I wanted it to have the eyes be visible first, I feel like it kind of gives it a bit of attitude. I want to add a shape key to this object. So I'll go here and then hit this plus button. And this first one records the original shape of the object, which is this one. And then I'll hit this plus button again for the first shape key. And with the cube selected and this key 1 selected, I'll go into edit mode. I'm just going to scale this, flatten out this cube like this, scale it down, move it down so that it covers the eye area. Just so that when I apply the Boolean, it will have the region of the mesh within the cube be visible, and then as we animate this shape key, it reveals the mesh underneath. So with that done, I'll just step out of edit mode, just like that. And you'll see on our first key, if we play with this value, it has recorded that change that we made inside edit mode. So now we can go ahead and add a Boolean modifier on our head object. So with that selected, I'll go into the modifiers, and I already have a modifier here. If you don't, you can just add one. Where is it? Boolean modifier. And then under object, you can just select that cube that we added. And now based on the operation, you can see how it's affecting our mesh. And I want this to be intersect, and that is that. And then something else I will do. So here I had, let's say we hide that modifier first. I have this object here, which is apparent to the head mesh, and the mesh of the eyes are two different objects. So I have all these three objects parented to this single empty so that I can select that and move it around. And this is how I do my animation on the object. So I'm also going to select this mesh and then parent it to this empty, Control P, and then object. So that now if I select this and move it around, they'll all move as a unit. So even the Boolean, the effects that we are adding using this object will be translated along with the animation. So you can go ahead and select this, and then under Boolean, enable that modifier, and this is what we have so far. So back under the shape keys, if we play with this value, you can see how it animates our mesh into view. For this next part, we may want to have some animation going on our objects. So I'll select this empty and then go to the animations tab. I will place a keyframe in the Z location, and then in the modifiers, I will add a noise. So this just adds some noise to that value. And if you play, you'll see what that looks like. Then you can play around with these values until you have something you like. So something like that will do. Yeah, something like that will do. So first of all, the first little detail I want to add is I think this slicing looks a little too neat, a little too perfect for the effect, the kind of vibe I'm going for. So what I'll do is I'll select this object and then add a modifier, and then I will add a displace modifier. In the texture, I'll add a new texture, call it Boolean displacement. And then add a new texture, and then I will use some clouds. So if you've looked at the previous video, you're going to see a lot of similarities in the workflow. So essentially what I'm trying to do is give some detail to the Boolean object, and then that detail and the displacement is going to translate into the object within its volume. And you might have to play around with these values and see what works for you. And also be cautious the level of detail in your meshes whenever you're using Booleans, because sometimes it can get out of hand. So something like that. And if I hide our object, you'll see there's a little bit of roughness that has been added to the edge of a Boolean object, of a Boolean operation. But then you'll notice that as it's moving about, because we parented the Boolean object to this empty, it's moving along with it. And I'd like to add some variation to just the movement in the animation. There's a little trick that you can do to just get some free complexity in your animation. And inside the Boolean operation, the Boolean modifier, in the coordinates from local, set it to global, and then watch what happens. So as the object is moving, essentially what we've done is the texture that's being used on the Boolean object. So I'll just unhide it so that we can see it. The texture being used in the displacement, when you set this to local, it's locked to the coordinates of the object itself. But when you set it to global, imagine like you've set the texture inside the 3D space. Imagine like it's a cloudy room. And this texture is being used to displace the mesh. So as the mesh moves through the space, it's like it's moving through this texture, and that variation that is moving through is translated onto the displacement. So just like that, you can see if you select this and start moving this around, you'll notice the displacement kind of starts dancing around because the texture is locked to the 3D space. And as the objects are moving around, it's translating into the Boolean object, which is translating to the mesh itself. And that's kind of how a little trick that you can use to add a little bit of complexity to your animation without too much manual work. it does have its disadvantages. For example, if you're animating something moving through space, the detail, the movement of the detail of the texture is going to depend on the speed of your object as it moves through 3D space. So that's just something that you realize when you're working with. And sometimes you can kind of lean into it. If you notice that it's a quirk of this workflow, you can kind of lean into it to do some interesting and creative things in there. So just so we can see the various steps of this effect, I'm going to duplicate this, Shift P. I'm going to move it. Then I'll hide these two. So now I can focus on this. I'll first disable the multi-res modifier just so I can get better viewport performance. And what I want to do is add that effect of that energy bubbling underneath the surface. And we'll do this by adding another displace modifier. So I'll just hide that, select the head, then add a displace modifier. I'll add a new displacement texture and set that texture to clouds. Then I can play around with the size. Before that, I'll go back into the modifier and set the coordinates again to global. So it's the same trick we'll be using over and over and over again to just add in all these layers of detail that play together to form this final coherent looking effect. So I'll go back and start playing with the scale. I want some nice detail, so I'll just play around with this until I have something I like. I'll also go back and in combination with the strength until I find a level that I like. Now again, because we set the coordinates to global, if we grab this and move it around, you'll see it inherits that displacement from that texture. But you'll notice, because if the motion of your animation is repetitive, the repetitiveness, it kind of breaks down. That effect starts to break down because you can tell there's a repeated kind of thing that's going on under that surface. But if you have like randomized motion through the space, it can help to hide that. Now, the last thing I want to do is tell Blender to leave out these regions around the eyes to exclude that from the displacement. So with that selected, I'll go into weight paint, and with the brush, with the weight of 1, I'll just try and come here and paint out these regions around the eyes, just like that. Just like that. And you'll notice a new vertex group popped up right here. And you can name it, give it an appropriate name, but where we're going to add it is inside the displacement texture down here. Pop that in, and I think it did the inverse, so you can just hit that so that it's affecting all these other regions except this area around the eye. So that's it from me. I hope you learned something from this video, and I'll see you in the next one.